All right, so now we are going to move into some organic chemistry. We have previously talked about some basic chemistry, and what separates basic chemistry from organic chemistry is basically just that we will be talking about organic compounds. So organic compounds. And when we say organic compounds, these are going to be molecules that contain carbon and hydrogen. So carbon and hydrogen. Organic meaning that it's related to organic things. We're not talking about different inorganic items like salts and things. We're talking about living things, things that our living things are made up of, so cells are made up of. So these are going to be molecules that contain carbon and hydrogen. So organic compounds and organic molecules that we're going to be talking about are going to be things like our carbohydrates. We're going to take a close look at carbohydrates, things like fats or lipids. We'll also be taking a close look at proteins. And we'll be taking a close look at RNA and DNA, which are called nucleic acids. So these are all of the different molecules that are required for life. So I'll just say required for life. So we're going to take a look at kind of the structure of organic compounds, why it is that carbon is so important, some of the different groups that we see in our organic compounds that make them functional, which allow them to interact with other molecules. And then we'll take a close look at these different groups of molecules. So when we compare our organic chemistry then to inorganic chemistry, this is the chemistry of non-living matter. Right, so when we talk about carbohydrates and lipids and proteins and our RNA and DNA, what we're talking about are living things. When we're talking about different things like gold, that's part of inorganic chemistry. That's not part of a living organism. So we mentioned carbon. So really what makes something organic is whether it contains carbon. Carbon we've already talked a lot about. It's very, very important. And we're going to talk about why it's important or why it's so useful. Carbon, first of all, it forms covalent bonds with many important atoms. So this is the first reason why carbon is such an important atom, why we see this in all of these organic molecules. So when we're talking about very important atoms or very important elements, what we're talking about are things like other carbons. So carbon can form a bond with carbon. It also forms bonds with hydrogens. It also forms bonds with oxygen, with nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So remember, all of these are the things that that make up the bulk of the weight of living things. So our CHONPS. These are our main elements that are very, very important, and carbon is able to form bonds with all of these different elements. And so they're able to, remember if we looked at carbon, I should probably draw that up here. If we take a look at carbon in the center here, we have our nucleus, remember? And then remember, flying around, we have our first shell with our electrons. I guess I should write up here. Remember, when we're talking about carbon, the atomic number is 6, so that means that we have 6 protons here in the nucleus. That also means that we have 6 electrons. So in our first shell, we have 2 electrons. And then the next shell, we have 3, 4, 5, 6. So we have 4 electrons in the outer shell of carbon. And if we remember, we fit how many total? right, 8 in this outer shell, which means that we're missing 4. And so this is how carbon is able to make these bonds. So it likes to make covalent bonds. If we remember what a covalent bond is compared to an ionic bond. Remember, covalent bonds are those where they share electrons. And so carbon likes to share electrons with other atoms. And it is able to do this in 4 different locations, or it's able to do this 4 times. And that's actually our next point, our second point here, is that carbon is able to form 4 covalent bonds. So carbon can form 4 covalent bonds. So this gives us lots of options. I'll just write lots of options here. So this gives us lots of options because when we're talking about filling this outer shell up here, remember it fills up with 8 total. And so it has 4, so it can either get rid of 4 or it can gain 4. And what it does is it gains 4 by way of covalent bonds. And that's the most we can do because if there were 5, then it would probably just get rid of 3 electrons. So the fact that carbon has 4 in its outer shell is actually very unique in that now it has the ability to form 4 bonds total. So if we think of something like methane as an example, we can form 4 bonds here. So we have 4 bonds to different hydrogens. This is methane. And then that allows us to have our full electron shell because remember when we're sharing electrons, what this really means is there are 2 electrons in each of these bonds here. So we have our inner ring, and then now it's sharing the 8 in the outer ring. So carbon is an ideal building block for making different molecules because it can share up to 4 times. Another reason why carbon is very important is that carbon bonds are very stable. And then since they're very stable, we can make chains of them. So again, we can bond it 4 times. What we see is that we can make chains of these carbons. We'll be taking a closer look at a lot of these chains. But we can make chains of carbons, and then typically what we see are hydrogens kind of hanging off of these chains. And again, we're able to make 4 bonds. So we're able to bond carbon to carbon to carbon to carbon, but then we're also able to stick some other stuff here. So we'll stick an OH over there, maybe an OH over here. But we still have the opportunity to have lots of other bonds. There we go. So this is a carbon chain. What that means, actually, we can give the term right now. This is called a hydrocarbon. So a hydrocarbon are organic molecules containing only carbon and hydrogen. So maybe I should take those clever little OHs off there. Hydroxyl group I threw in just for fun. We'll just stick the hydrogens back in there. So this will make it a hydrocarbon. So hydro, or hydra, meaning hydrogen, and then carbon. So it's made up of carbons and hydrogens. Carbons and hydrogens. So that's a hydrocarbon. And if we remember, is this going to be a polar bond or a non-polar bond? Right, it's non-polar because remember our carbon-hydrogen bond is a non-polar bond. They have similar electronegativity. So if it's non-polar, is it hydrophilic or is it hydrophobic? Right, hydrophobic, right? So water-fearing, and that's because it's nonpolar, right? It doesn't have the ability to form those hydrogen bonds with the H2O that has the partial positive, partial negative. In this case, we have our hydrocarbon, which is just carbon's hydrogens, and since they're nonpolar, they don't have that partial positive, partial negative, and so they don't interact with water. These hydrocarbons are also often gas at room temperature. So at room temperature, they can turn into a gas. They have very few reactions, so you can see that right now We have all of these carbons that are attached to hydrogens. They're very happy to do that. They're in these solid 4 covalent bonds, so there are very, very few interactions with things because there's just not the partial positive or partial negative. And so since these do not really interact very much, we actually need something called functional groups to make them interactive. And we're going to talk in just a little bit about different functional groups. I want to finish up the reason why carbon is so important, and then we'll come back to the functional groups. So far what we've said is that carbon is an important molecule. It's what makes something organic. And some of the things that make it important is, one, that it forms covalent bonds with many important atoms, so they're able to interact with many of these important things like oxygen and hydrogen. Secondly, that carbon can form 4 covalent bonds, which gives us a lot of options because it's kind of the maximum number of bonds that we can make. Third, that these bonds are actually very, very stable. Fourth, since we have the ability to make all of these bonds, they can actually form single, double, or triple bonds. And not all molecules can do that because that depends on the number of valence electrons. If it depends on the number of valence electrons, in the case of carbon, we can have, as we've already seen, we can do a single bond where we have a carbon single bonded to another carbon, and then we have single bonds to hydrogens here. So this would be an example of a single bond. Then if we have a double bond, we'll just use the carbon as an example. We'll have a double bond to carbon, and that gives us the option, remember, for 4 different bonds. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4. So then we can have a double bond. This is butane. And then we can have a triple bond. So each of these lines, again, is a bond, which means that it contains 2 electrons that it's sharing. And this is acetylene. So in this case, you can see carbon can make single bonds, which we see in hydrocarbons. We can have double bonds, in this example butane, and then we can have triple bonds. And again, this is because it has this ability to make 4 different covalent bonds. So it can have the triple bond, which is the highest number of bonds between 2 atoms, and then it still has the opportunity here to be attached to something else. So this could be attached to many things over here, and it would still have the triple bond in it. So it's very versatile. It can have many different types of bonds. And then for number 5, or 5th reason why carbon is so fantastic, is that these carbon bonds, carbon single bonds, can rotate. And since they allow for rotation, we can actually get lots of shapes, which is very, very helpful. So we can rotate bonds. We can have these long hydrocarbons, but then we can flip them around and we can turn them into rings, for example. So if we have these carbons, in this case maybe we have the OH in there as something to interact with. Since all of these in here are single bonds, we can actually kind of curl them around. Let's see how many I have here, 4. And then they can bond with each other in this way. And then we can stick the hydrogens back on here. I'm not sure which one I stuck the OH on. I guess I keep messing myself up with that one. But so we can lose a couple of hydrogens here, and then we can form a bond, and it can end up being a bond between the carbons, and then we can have a straight chain form here, we can have a ring form here. And so these things can rotate in order to form different things. So like this OH perhaps would not actually end up in this direction. It would end up in a different direction over here. But it can rotate and it can move around, and it depends on the things that are attached to it as well. So the reason I put this hydroxyl group on here is because this would be something that would interact with water, right? Because this is a polar portion of the molecule. And so because of that interaction, we might see some movement in this molecule. So if we were to place this molecule in the straight chain form into water, for example, then we might see this kind of twist and turn into a different formation rather than this straight chain form. And then that allows for different types of interactions. And speaking of this hydroxyl molecule, what we're going to move into now is the different functional groups that I've already mentioned. So when we are talking about carbon, we have all of these 5 different things we went over that make carbon so special and make carbon really useful for living things. Now, when we talk about its interaction, we already talked about hydrocarbons. Remember, hydrocarbons are those that contain only carbon and hydrogen. And if they only contain carbon and hydrogen, then they're not going to interact with anything else because they're nonpolar. And since they don't interact with anything else, then they're just going to be hanging out, not doing anything, which is fine. But in living things, we need to have reactions. And in order to have reactions, then we have things called functional groups. So now we're going to take a look at the different types of functional groups that there are. You should be able to identify the functional groups, so draw out the functional groups and identify them on different molecules. So first let's kind of define what a functional group is. So a functional group is an atom or atoms replacing a hydrogen in an organic molecule. So they are usually polar. There are some that are non-polar, we'll mention that, but they're usually polar, which means then they allow for interactions with water. And the formation of hydrogen bonds. So remember that hydrogen bonds don't just apply to water. So we say that we have that the fact that these are polar functional groups, or typically polar, allow for interactions with water because water is a polar molecule. And then we can form hydrogen bonds with the water. But remember, hydrogen bonds don't necessarily have to mean water. There are other things that we can form hydrogen bonds with, namely other functional groups. And the reason that we then have these functional groups, again, is these hydrocarbons are not going to be interacting with their environment. But in order to build things like cells, in order to build things like human beings or other animals, we need to have interactions. We need to have things that are going to interact with each other and give rise to life. So this is going to allow them to participate in more reactions needed in living things. So let's take a look at our functional groups. The first one is the hydroxyl group, which you should already be familiar with. Our hydroxyl group is the OH group, which is this right here. So let me kind of talk about the way that I've written this here. So this R is basically the rest of the molecule. That's how I remember it. The R is for the rest of the molecule. So what we're looking at here is just this hydroxyl group on the end here, and that's our functional group. And then we just use this R as saying, like, here's the rest of the molecule. It could be this huge chain, it could be a huge ring, it could be a very complex whatever. And then we see that we have this hydroxyl functional group on it. So this is just saying, here's some stuff over in this direction, but what we're looking at here, what we're talking about, the functional group is our hydroxyl group. So the first one is our hydroxyl group. Then we have our carbonyl. And the carbonyl is actually a carbon double bonded to an oxygen. And then in the case of the carbonyl, we'll have two kind of rest of the molecule areas there. A carbonyl is also called a ketone. We see it in ketones. We'll stick with carbonyl, but that's just a side note. So we have part of the molecule on the left side here, and then we have this carbon double bonded to an oxygen. And that's going to be our carbonyl group. And again, remember, we already know the hydroxyl group. Over here, we've got these electrons that are making the oxygen and the hydrogen bond polar. So we've got this partial negative here and this partial positive here. And we see the same thing here. Right, so we have a partial negative on this oxygen, especially because it's a double bond. That means there's a lot more electrons flying around that oxygen, and then the carbon then is a partial positive. So we have the ability to interact and have some hydrogen bonding. The next group is a carboxyl group. Our carboxyl group is a carbon double bonded to an oxygen, similar to the carbonyl, but then instead of having another R group on the side there, what we have is a negative oxygen. So in this case, we've got a lot of electrons flying around here. We actually have we're going to take those off just to clarify. Oops. There we go. So our carboxyl group, when you're trying to seek out the functional groups and see where they're going to interact, we have our negative oxygen over here, and then we have our oxygen double bonded to the carbon on the other side. So that would make our carboxyl group. The next group is our amino group. The amino group is a nitrogen, and then it has 2 hydrogens on it. So that's a really easy one to identify, because if you see a nitrogen in there, then it's going to be the amino group. The others are different configurations of oxygen, basically. Oxygen, hydrogens, and carbons. The amino group has that nitrogen in there. And then the last one is the phosphoryl group, or the phosphate group. And we're going to be seeing a whole lot of these different functional groups. We will be talking a lot more about the phosphoryl group. We'll also see the amino group as well. So we have our R for the rest of the molecule, which is bonded to an O, and then of course we have the phosphate in there, giving it its name. Double bonded to another oxygen there. So our phosphoryl group, or our phosphate group here, of course, then contains phosphate, another one that's easy to identify because it has that difference. But then you can see the phosphate is surrounded by lots of oxygens here. It's a very high energy group, and we're going to talk a lot more about that when we get to cell processes in 2 units from now. So let's take a look at these a little bit closer up. So those are the 5 functional groups that you're responsible for knowing. Let's take a little bit closer look at them. So we have our hydroxyl group. And remember, the hydroxyl group is our OH. So our hydroxyl group is important in carbohydrates. It's also important, we'll see these a lot in proteins, and also in our nucleic acids. So just kind of a little bit about each of these. So our hydroxyl group, we'll see these in carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids. Our carbonyl group, remember what our carbonyl group looked like. Carbon double bonded to an oxygen. So our carbonyl group is important in carbohydrates. Just as a note here, I'm going to start shortening my handwriting here. So CHO is short for carbohydrates. That's because carbohydrates are typically made up of these long chains of carbons and hydrogens with some oxygens in them. So shorthand for carbohydrates is CHO, which I'll be shortening it as we move on through the organic chemistry section or unit. So the carbonyl group is important carbohydrates. Then our next group, our carboxyl group. So remember the carboxyl group, what that looked like. Similar to the carbonyl, but then we add an extra oxygen that's negatively charged there. And the carboxyl group actually ends up being a weak acid. And this is because what we end up seeing here is we have this rest of the molecule, and then because this oxygen is negatively charged, it pulls on and grabs off a hydrogen in order to make it more stable. And so this actually is called a carboxylic acid. And this is because, if you remember what an acid is it's something that releases hydrogen ions in solution. And so we can see that there's this back and forth here between this carboxyl group that does not have the hydrogen and the carboxylic acid, which does contain the hydrogen. And when we go back to the negative oxygen, what we've done then is we have released this hydrogen ion. And the reason that it is positively charged is because the electron that the hydrogen would normally have around it goes to the oxygen, and that's why we see that the oxygen up here is negatively charged, because it has an extra electron in it. It has grabbed that extra electron from the hydrogen. And so we have our carboxyl group can make things be weak acids because it can grab onto the hydrogen. That's what makes it an acid. is that it can then release that hydrogen into solution, increasing the hydrogen ion concentration. Remember, when we increase the hydrogen ion concentration, we're decreasing the pH, and that's acidic. And so then we are able to release that. This is important. Our carboxyl group we see in, rather than writing important every time, but we see them in proteins and in lipids or fats. All right, so our next group is the amino group. And remember, our amino group is pretty easy to identify since it has that nitrogen in there. Now, what we see here with the amino group is this one can actually act as a weak base. Now, remember what a base is. A base is something that decreases hydrogen ions in solution. So if we have a decrease of hydrogen ions, this is because our amino group can actually bond to one more hydrogen ion. And then what we end up seeing is that we have N, whoops, that's not an N, our nitrogen, and then it's bonded to 3 hydrogens, and then it's positively charged. So what we then end up having, if I write it a little bit better, NH3+. And so then this is a base because then it is going to gather up, or it kind of soaks up these hydrogen ions, taking them out of solution. And so then it's going to increase the pH, which then makes it more alkaline or more basic. So the amino group is important in proteins because what we see in proteins are amino acids. So in the name there, amino acids are what make up proteins, and we'll take a closer look at that in just a little bit. So we see them in proteins and in nucleic acids. We'll talk about that later as well. And then our last one is our phosphoryl group, or the phosphate group. And remember, that one contains the phosphate, of course. Lots of oxygens there. And again, we can see something similar that we saw here earlier with our carboxyl group. This actually can be a weak acid as well. So a weak acid, because we have the same situation, we can grab onto our hydrogen ion and attach it here, giving us an OH at the top. And then we can release that hydrogen ion in solution. If we release that hydrogen ion, then we've increased the pH, or we've increased the hydrogen ion concentration in solution, which is decreasing the pH, making it acidic. And then in this case, what we can actually do is we can do that 2 times here. We have 2 very electronegative oxygens here, so it can release 1 or 2 hydrogens, so it can be a weak acid, releasing those hydrogens in solution then. We see our phosphoryl group is very, very important in our nucleic acids. All right, so just some examples. So we've gone through our functional groups, and you should be able to identify the functional groups on different molecules. So for example, if I drew something, like let's say I draw a molecule that looks like this. And asked you to identify the different groups. Would you be able to identify those different groups? So take a moment there and try to see if you can figure out which groups we have in this molecule. All right, so the first one, remember, is very easy. Right up here, right? What is this group? Right, the amino group. Remember, it has the nitrogen, which makes it pretty easy to identify. Then we can see some other things. So this entire middle chain here is not going to be any sort of functional group, right? Because we have lots of carbons, lots of hydrogens that are not going to be interacting with anything. But up here, what is this group called? Right, a carboxyl group. And then one more, another carboxyl group. Good. So that's just one example of how you should be able to identify these different things in different molecules. So you'll need to be able to do that on the quizzes as well as the exams. So you should understand the different functional groups. And as we move along throughout the semester, we are going to be making use of these functional groups. So it's important that you understand them and that you're able to locate them on molecules. And then as we're walking through these different molecules and through cell processes and things throughout the rest of the semester, then you'll see why these are important and where they're coming in to the entire overall broad thing. So the next thing we're going to talk about is metabolism. So we talked briefly about metabolism at the very, very beginning of the semester, the very first lecture, because we said that all living things have metabolism. So if we remember what metabolism is in a little bit more detail, metabolism is all the chemical reactions in a cell or a body or an organism and these reactions, this is separate, but these reactions use or release energy. Okay, so metabolism are all of the chemical reactions in an organism. If we're talking about a bacterium, for example, it would be within a cell. So that's why we said cell. Or a human within a body, or an animal, or the organism. So all of the chemical reactions that happen within an organism is the metabolism. And so then I mentioned that these reactions either use energy or they release energy. And we're going to go into further detail about how that works. But just for example, we'll have our complex molecules. And our complex molecules are going to be those that we've already mentioned, but things like proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. These, by the way, are the 4 biological molecules that we're going to be talking about and looking at in much more detail as we're moving through metabolism and through talking about them. So these are 4 biological molecules you should know. I'm actually going to scoot this up a bit. So we have our complex molecules, and then what we see is they can either use or release energy. So we can go from our complex molecules, and we're going to then be going into our more simple molecules. And we're going to look at this in much more detail as we're moving on here. This is kind of a general overview. But our simple molecules would be things like amino acids, which we'll talk about, sugars, which we'll talk about, fatty acids, our nitrogenous bases, CO2, and H2O, we'll say. So we have things like complex molecules, which are big and long, and as their name implies, complex. And then we have our simple molecules. And what we see is when we go from our complex molecules up here down to our simple molecules, what we're doing is we're breaking down. So we're breaking down the complex molecules into our simple molecules. These are called catabolic reactions. So if we're breaking down from complex, which starts with a C, it's called a catabolic reaction, which also starts with a C. So we start with complex and turn it into simple molecules, then it's called a catabolic reaction. And these reactions are those that release energy. So then what we see is we have a release of energy in the form of ATP, which we will talk about. So then we get to our simple molecules, but in our body, we take these simple molecules. So if we're going from our simple molecules, we also then will be building up to complex molecules. When we do that, we are building instead of breaking down, and these are called anabolic reactions. So anabolic reactions are going to be building from our simple molecules to our complex molecules. In this case, then, it requires energy. So we have to put energy into this system when we're talking about an anabolic reaction. We're releasing energy from the system when we're talking about catabolic reactions. So in this case, then, we're taking energy and we're putting it into it in order to make our complex molecules. And so this is what we're talking about when we talk about metabolism. We're talking about all of the interactions, all of the chemical reactions inside of an organism, which are taking complex molecules and turning them into simple molecules, taking simple molecules and turning them into complex molecules. And so it's all of the reactions, meaning all of the catabolic reactions and all of the anabolic reactions. And all of these things rely on energy. So if we're breaking down a complex molecule, we're releasing energy. And if we are taking simple molecules and building them up to complex molecules, then that requires energy. We have to put energy into the system in order to do that. So let's take a look at some of these reactions, some of these interactions. So what is a reaction? A reaction, as we just talked about, are breaking and reforming bonds to create different molecules. So breaking and reforming bonds to create different molecules. All right, so you typically see this in an equation. So something like A plus B goes to C plus D. Now, it doesn't have to be A and B on one side, so it doesn't have to be two things. It can be one. So A can go to C plus D, for example, or it can be A plus B plus C plus D goes to E. So the number of items on this side and the number of items on this side can be anything from 1 to dozens. So this is a reaction, though. The things on the left side are called reactants. And our reactants are those that we start with, so just what we start with. And again, sometimes there's only one reactant, or sometimes there are lots of reactants. On the other side here, we have what are called products. And these are what we end up with. And again, in this case, it could be one single product. It doesn't have to be C plus D, whatever C and D are, but it can be one single product. So for example, a reaction that we're going to be taking a very close look at throughout the semester is C6H12O6. Which is a complex sugar, which is glucose, plus 6 oxygen molecules goes to 6 carbon dioxide molecules, plus 6 water molecules. So if we look at this equation, if we look at this chemical reaction, what we're saying here is these on this side are the reactants. Over here on the right, we have our products. And so our reactants are the C6H12O6, which is glucose, and oxygen. Those are reactants. And then our products are carbon dioxide, what we get out of the reaction. So if we react glucose with oxygen, we get carbon dioxide and water. And actually over here we get plus energy in the form of ATP. Now that's not actually part of the reaction per se, but that's actually what's going to happen because of this type of reaction. Another thing to note is that many reactions are reversible. So that means that they can go in either direction. So in that case, it would be something like A plus B can go to C plus D, but then also that would mean C plus D can go to A plus B. So we actually have that double arrow there, and that double arrow means that they can go both ways. A plus B can combine to become C and D, or C and D can then go back to be A and B. So an example of that is, for example, if we take water and we add carbon dioxide to it, what we end up making here is H2CO3, which is carbonic acid. But our carbonic acid can then go back to water and carbon dioxide. Or our carbonic acid can then dissociate in a different way into bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion. And this is actually a reaction that we see often, but this is also a reversible reaction. And so then actually when this gets written out, we can write out water plus carbon dioxide goes to carbonic acid, or it can go backwards, which then goes to bicarbonate plus a hydrogen ion, which can go backwards. And so this, if you'll notice, this is water plus carbon dioxide, which is what we breathe out. In our bodies, carbon dioxide, when our cells are making carbon dioxide for us to breathe out, before it's breathed out, it actually goes into the bloodstream and it can mix with water. When it mixes with water, it can make carbonic acid. Now, we don't, in this situation, we can make carbonic acid, or then we can have bicarbonate and the hydrogen ion. Now we see this kind of go back and forth between carbonic acid and bicarbonate plus the hydrogen ion because we have a hydrogen ion in here that can make our blood more acidic. So if it stays as the hydrogen ion, then our blood will become more acidic. So then what we actually see is that these things are going to go into carbonic acid in order to bring down the hydrogen ion concentration in the blood. So anyway, that's kind of a side note. We'll talk about that later in the semester, but you can see that we can have a reaction that can run both ways. It's a reversible reaction. So let's take a closer look at some of these catabolic reactions and anabolic reactions. So if we talk first about our catabolic reactions, again, our catabolic reactions is when we break down complex, I'm capitalizing that to remember that complex starts with a C and catabolic starts with a C. So we break down our complex molecules into simple molecules. And this releases energy. Now, we already saw that if we had our complex molecules up here, and we turn them into simple molecules down here, and then we have this release of energy. This energy, then, as we saw it, is going to go to fuel the next type of reaction, which, remember, what was the name of that reaction? Right, anabolic reaction. So this one, just to back up another moment here, so this releases energy. This energy is then used to fuel anabolic reactions. So we take our complex molecules and we break them down into simple molecules, and when we do that, we're releasing energy. That energy that's released is then going to allow us to take simple molecules and build them up to complex molecules. Our building up, remember, anabolic reactions are where we build. So building more complex molecules from simple molecules. So we are building things up. In this case, we are joining together our simple molecules and building them up into complex. And then this, of course, it doesn't release energy, but it requires energy. which we get from catabolic reactions. So we have this breaking down and building up. And if we think about this simply, we're going to get into more details here, but if we think about this in a simple way, when we are talking about taking complex molecules and breaking them down into simple molecules, we can think of something like eating food, right? If we eat food, we eat things like proteins, we eat things like carbohydrates, we eat things like fats. And so then our body is going to take those complex molecules and break them down into smaller pieces. And we see this in our digestive system, right? So we take something that's a really complex molecule, like a carbohydrate, let's say a starch from a potato that you've eaten. So starch is a really, really long chain of glucose molecules. And when we eat that starch, that's a really, really long molecule, and our body in the digestive system is going through the process of breaking down that molecule. As it breaks it down, this would be our catabolic reaction. We're breaking down this complex starch molecule into our simple molecules so that we can get them into the bloodstream, so we can get them to the rest of the body. So now we are taking in these individual glucose molecules because we've broken them down, and that is going to release energy. So we're going to gain energy from that reaction. But now we've gotten the glucose into our body, and then we're going to use that in different reactions. But then we've got this energy that we have released. Now that we've released this energy, that can be used to do other things. Like let's say it's used to take amino acids and build them up into proteins. So if let's say we're making more muscle, or we're growing from a child to an adult, we need to have protein. We're going to use these pieces, and we're going to use the energy that was used from breaking down starch, or gained from breaking down starch into glucose. And then we can use that energy to build proteins, for example. We also use it to build long chains of carbohydrates again, but we'll get into that in just a moment. So then we can use that energy, put that into the system to make proteins, for example. So some reactions you do need to understand, and you do need to know. The first general type of reaction is a dehydration reaction. So a dehydration reaction is a type of anabolic reaction. This is where we join two molecules and release water. So dehydration, D meaning without, and then hydro or hydra is water, right, relating to water. So hydration is water, increasing water. In this case, we're dehydration, so we're taking away water. So this is an anabolic reaction. So anabolic meaning we're building up. So in this case, we are going to be joining two molecules, building a more complex molecule by joining two molecules. And in the process of this, we actually end up releasing water. So if we think about if this is our molecule, we're going to have a hydrogen here and an OH here. And this can be the R group here, the rest of the molecule. And then we have another one of these molecules. And if we are going to combine them, right, so we're adding them together, we're going to join these two molecules, then what we get is we have the hydrogen group here, we have the one R group here, and then we have lost water in the process. And so you can see if we have the reaction between this, let me do it in a different color, this hydroxyl group here and this hydrogen here, this gives us H2O. And so we've lost H2O in the process. We've released water. And then what we have is our molecule. These two molecules are put together into now a more complex molecule. And in the process, we have lost water. So it's a dehydration reaction. An example of this would be if we took methanol and methanol, and through a dehydration reaction, we get something like dimethyl ether, and of course, water. I guess I should have just written water here. So in this case, what we're talking about with methanol, CH3OH, and then we have the same thing, but we have, I'm going to write it backwards here just so you can see the dehydration reaction. So this is the same thing, right? CH3 is just on this side. Whoops, I don't know why I write 2. CH3 on this side here, CH3 here, and then the OH group here, the hydroxyl group on both of them. So if we take methanol and methanol, then it's going to go to dimethyl ether, and in the process we have made water. So whichever one of these, so we have our H2O, this oxygen is still in there. So we have our dimethyl ether, and then we have our water, which has been released in the process. So this is a type of dehydration reaction. This is what we see in living things often during an anabolic reaction. So when we have anabolic reactions, we're building complex molecules. This usually releases water into the environment via this type of reaction, which is called a dehydration reaction. Now, on the other hand, we have what's called hydrolysis. So hydrolysis is another type of reaction. In this case, this is a type of catabolic reaction. That breaks up a molecule by adding water. So this would be essentially the opposite of the dehydration reaction, hydrolysis. So in this case, hydro meaning water, and lysis is to break something down. So breaking by water. So we're going to add water to something, it's going to break down the molecule. So this is the opposite that we're seeing. So if we use our same example of our random R groups, so we can take this molecule and we're going to go from a complex molecule, right? This is our larger molecule, our complex molecule. We are going to then lose water, or not lose water, but gain water here. We're going to take water and put it right in this bond here. And so then we get what we started with in the other reaction that we saw, plus this. So hydrolysis is using water to break down molecules. And so then we would see the opposite of our other reaction. In this case, we could do something like ethanol. So CH3, CH2O, CH2, whoops, CH3 plus water goes to CH2OH plus all right, there we go. So in this case, we have diethyl ether. Diethyl ether is this very long molecule here. And then we're adding water to the reaction. So this is a hydrolysis reaction. It's a catabolic reaction. So we're adding water to this, and of course we're going to add water right in here in the middle in this example. And so then what we end up with is ethanol and ethanol. So we add water, and then you can see that if we take this water and we put it in this area here, that then what we end up with is it's no longer this single oxygen here. Say that single oxygen is this one. We actually put the water in here, the H2, so 2 H's, and the oxygen. So this is a catabolic reaction. It's breaking down a complex molecule into smaller molecules. And again, we're going to be talking more about these types of reactions as we're going to be looking at our different biological molecule groups, our carbohydrates, our lipids, our proteins, and our nucleic acids. So before we finish kind of our intro to organic chemistry, what we're going to talk about are enzymes. And this is because when we're talking about all of these different reactions, the building up of things and the breaking down of things, so our catabolic and anabolic reactions, our dehydration reactions, our hydrolysis reactions, all of these reactions are happening within the body. They're happening within the body. They can do this on their own. So our molecules will be bumping into each other. Water is a big component of our body. They're bumping into each other. They're breaking apart using water. They're releasing water. All of these things are just going to be happening naturally. However, we don't want to sit around for things to just happen naturally oftentimes. They do, but our bodies need things to happen a little bit faster than that. And so we have things called enzymes. And enzymes are a molecule, or an enzyme is a molecule that speeds up a reaction. So we have all of these catabolic and anabolic reactions happening naturally or normally in the body without any assistance. But then we have enzymes, and enzymes are going to assist in this process. So it's a molecule that speeds up a reaction. An enzyme is also a catalyst. Catalyst is something that speeds up a reaction without being used up. So basically these are like little tiny machines in our body. So they're molecules. They're made out of the same stuff that our other molecules are made out of. But our enzymes are going to be like little machines that are going to bind to the reactants and then change them into the products. So you put something in, the machine, the enzyme, is going to do what it needs to do to then get your product at the end. So if we're talking about a catabolic reaction, we're taking our complex molecule, sticking it in the enzyme is going to go through the process of breaking it, break it down into simple molecules and release them. And then we have our simple molecules at the end. And then it can do the opposite as well. So we have our anabolic reaction. So if we have our enzyme, we're going to take our two individual or more, whatever, simple molecules, and then it will combine them. It will create those bonds, and then we'll release the product, which is our complex molecule. So what they do is they actually bind to the reactants and hold them near each other. When they do this, they put stress on the bonds so they are more likely to break. So if we take a look at this, kind of the example of a molecule that can be drawn. So this right here, this is our enzyme. So it's this big lumpy molecule here. And remember, the enzyme is going to help to speed up the reaction. So rather than just letting these things break apart on their own, instead what we're going to do is utilize this enzyme. So it's going to speed up this reaction, but it's not going to be used up on its own. Right here, what I've kind of drawn in this area, I'll darken it a little bit. This area right here is called the active site. Now, the active site is where we're going to see this binding to the reactants. So if we take our molecule here, it's going to fit in here like a key. And that is an important concept. It's like a key in a lock. So our enzyme, this particular enzyme, only has this one particular active site. And it looks exactly like this. Of course, this is just a drawing, but the active site is exactly this shape, which means that this active site will only bind to a molecule that is exactly this shape. So this is the kind of the green molecule that I have just drawn here. This green molecule is called the substrate. The substrate is what the enzyme is going to be acting on. So we have our enzyme, we have the active site of the enzyme, and then we have our substrate, which is going to be the thing that's going to be acted on. Substrate. So then, as was mentioned, it's going to put stress on these bonds in here. So we're putting stress on these bonds. The enzyme is kind of twisting, perhaps. It's making some sort of change that then, when we move over here, let's see if I can draw this again. This is our active site. So we have our substrate, and then when we move over here, what we end up having, we'll draw it in different colors just so it's easier to see. We have now broken this molecule. Oh, I guess this was straight across here. We've broken this molecule, and now it's in two different parts. And then these two different parts will leave, and what we have are our products. So we have our enzyme. It has its active site. It's going to bind to the substrate, which would be the reactant. In this case, we have a single reactant. And then we're going to go through the process here. The enzyme is going to speed up the reaction by putting some stress on those bonds, and then it'll break this molecule. So break this molecule right here, and then what we end up with are two products at the end. So as we just mentioned, it's like a key in the lock. So the enzyme is the lock, and then the substrate or the reactant or reactants are the key or keys. And so enzymes must have the correct shape in order to work. So enzymes must have the correct shape to work properly. And this is important because, as we said, it's like a key in a lock. If we change that lock, then the key will not fit in it. If it doesn't fit the key, then we're not able to go through that reaction, and the enzyme is worthless. It won't work. So how does the enzyme speed up the reaction? Let's take a quick look here at what it does, because this is important to understand. We're going to look at a graph here. On this side over here, this is energy, and down here is our reaction. So when we look at a reaction, we have something called activation energy. Or energy of activation. And what that means is that this is the amount of energy it takes to get a reaction to run, meaning get the reaction to do the reaction. So the amount of energy required to get a reaction, to run. So reactions happen pretty slowly in the body. They're bumping into each other, but they happen pretty slowly due to the activation energy. So if we look at the amount of energy, if we are going along here, then we have to put in a certain amount of energy. Let's make that a little bit bigger. So we're going along, and then we have to put in energy in order to make the products. So over here, what we have are the reactants, and then we have to increase. So remember, this is energy. Our reactants are at this energy here. We have to get from here all the way up here. We have to put in a whole lot of energy, lots and lots of energy, in order to get the reactants to turn into the products over here. So we have to put a whole lot of energy into the system, lots and lots and lots of ATP, in order to take the reactants and turn them into the products. This is without an enzyme. This is just the body going about bumping into things and breaking things apart. Now, if we add an enzyme, what we see, we start off with reactants here, but then what it does is it actually decreases or lowers the activation energy. So instead, with an enzyme, we would see something like this. So this is with an enzyme. So you can see the energy of activation here is much, much smaller. So what an enzyme does is it reduces the activation energy needed to make the reaction run. Because remember, it puts stress on things, or it holds things close together. So if we're talking about breaking down something, as we saw in the illustration earlier, is that we'll put the reactant, the complex molecule in there, and it will put stress on those bonds. It will twist them slightly to make them more apt to break. And so if we have our enzyme, then the amount of actual energy needed, in this case, is much, much lower. So we're decreasing by this much energy here. So we're decreasing the activation energy because we are stressing out those bonds, and we have to put just a little bit of energy into that then to finally break the bonds and get to the products. Now, if we're building something up, it's very, very similar. Our reactants, we have our two simple molecules, and we're going to build them up into a more complex molecule. So what the enzyme will do is it will have both of those molecules, or however many, both of those molecules sitting right next to each other, and it'll kind of push them together. So they're really, really close, and they'll kind of put a little bit of stress on them to force them to combine, force them to then turn into the product, the single thing that we're going to get at the end in this case. So what we're doing then is we're decreasing the activation energy, which means that things will happen much, much faster. And that's exactly what we see, is we have lots and lots of enzymes in the body. All of these enzymes are making these reactions go much, much faster than they would normally go. All right, so this is kind of the summary of our first part of organic chemistry. We talked about enzymes, the importance of enzymes, that they're a catalyst. We can use them to build or break down our molecules, and they do not get used up. We talked about the different types of reactions, our catabolic reactions, which is where we break down complex molecules into simple molecules. We have our anabolic reactions, which is where we're building up two complex molecules from simple molecules. That includes the two general types of reactions that we have for each of those. Our dehydration reaction is an anabolic reaction where we release water, and our hydrolysis reaction is using water to break down a complex molecule into simple molecules. We talked about what a reaction is, and then we talked about what metabolism is. So all of the chemical reactions in an organism, and about how in a catabolic reaction we release energy, and then we use that energy in an anabolic reaction. Don't forget, we talked about these functional groups, which are going to be very important when we look at our different types of biological molecules, which are in the next lectures. So you should know these different functional groups, know what they look like and how they react or where we see them. And then we talked about what makes carbon so important. And remember, we're talking about organic chemistry, we're talking about organic compounds, the different ones. We talked about carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Those four are biological molecules, and they include carbon, and we have our 5 different reasons why carbon is so important.